This presentation will explore emotional intelligence and coping skills for student athletes. There are three key objectives to this presentation. Firstly, to provide an overview of the theoretical issues regarding emotional intelligence and coping. Secondly, to demonstrate the use and interpretation of emotional intelligence and coping measures. And finally, to apply coping and emotional intelligence interventions with a sample of volunteer student athletes, evaluating the efficacy of these.
So we move on to objective 2, to demonstrate the use and interpretation of emotional intelligence and coping measures. So we'll look at an overview of emotional intelligence based measures. There are performance based tests, which there is an objective right and wrong answer, where the person does a whole series of tests and they are scored seemingly objectively. There are issues with those we'll come to later. The second is self-report measures, where the person reports the belief that they are able to monitor their own emotions and the belief that they're able to monitor others' emotions. And we'll look at some of the issues of those later too. But when we look at the relationship between performance tests and self-report measures, they are actually quite weakly correlated, surprisingly, given that both of them are supposed to be measuring emotional intelligence. But it's suggested that the beliefs in your ability and the actual ability actually assess completely different aspects of emotional intelligence. And it's logical that someone might have a strong conviction or strong beliefs that they are very emotionally intelligent, but their objective scores are quite low. In other words, they're using information that others wouldn't agree is the emotionally correct decision. But what it is, it is certainly a potentially confusing aspect of the emotional intelligence literature, and it's worth, when you're looking at any study that has assessed emotional intelligence, to work out whether it is a self-report measure, which is assessing their beliefs, or it's an ability measure, which is a test, a score, a performance test where there's no objective criteria to actually get the right answer. We've looked at the emotional intelligence scale as suggested earlier, and it's a 33-item self-report measure, and it assesses the extent to which an individual can identify and understand and regulate their emotions in themselves and in others. And there are longer versions of this available, but they typically include more reverse scored items. But we've been using a 33-item measure, and you'll be completing a 33-item measure which runs alongside this presentation. Now, one of the key things is that emotional intelligence has a number of different subcomponents, and the notion that you can assess in a single score might result in a considerable degree of a considerable loss of information, in that your ability to be aware of your own emotions may be very different to your ability to be aware of others' emotions. And what you'll see in the literature is emotional intelligence often used as a single score, and while that's not entirely inappropriate, from an intervention point of view, it's far better because you get far more detailed knowledge when you've got the subcomponent scores. And what we have done is looked at the subcomponent scores for the EIS, and have 6 factors based on the theoretical principles within emotional intelligence. And we looked at the appraisal of own emotions, items such as I'm aware of my emotions as I experience them. And people who believe that they are aware of those emotions will report high scores accordingly. Those who are unaware will report low scores accordingly. Appraisal of others' emotions. Optimism, and it's questionable whether optimism is truly an emotional intelligence concept or a personality trait. And the debate on that will continue, but we've left it in because it was part of the original set of items developed by Schutte, but just to recognise there is debate on whether that should be a part of emotional intelligence. Regulation of emotions, and this seems fairly central to what the concept's all about. I have control of my emotions being an indicator. Social skills being the term that the authors of the test used. It could be the regulation of emotions in others, might be a better way of describing it, an item that I help people feel better when they are down, being an example of being able to manage the emotions of others. And finally, the utilisation of emotions. When I experience a positive emotion, I know how to make it last, and the idea that you can maintain positive emotions and use emotions in a very productive way. Now, some of the other assessments of emotional intelligence based on the self-report, and we'll look at Baron's model. And Baron's model divides into 4 areas: intrapersonal, interpersonal, stress management, adaptability, and they lead to general mood and which also lead on to effective performance. We'll just unpack that in a little bit more, and that it then divides into a series of subcomponents of self-regard in the intraperson, stress management, things like stress tolerance, impulse control. Impulse control is quite a useful one for anger management interventions, adaptability, interpersonal, and general mood. And it's been criticised a little bit in the literature for throwing things in which are sort of social skills or personality concepts, but that is one of the issues within emotional intelligence theory and research in general, that a clear definition doesn't exist, or a commonly agreed definition doesn't exist, and people tend to define emotional intelligence in the way that they are measuring it, and so you have conflicting definitions. So that's also something else to be aware of when reading about the concept. So Baron's measure is 133 items, and one of the biggest limitations for people who want to use the EQI is that the test administrators must have been on a course and must be registered and licensed, and those courses can be quite expensive, and therefore this is something that you can't learn one day and then take away the next without being on the course. So it's worth knowing about, but it may not be the tool that you use unless you have someone who's qualified to use it. We'll look at some of the ability measures of emotional intelligence, and this in itself is an intriguing concept, because the notion that you can have an objective score for emotional intelligence in itself is debatable. And what these tests do is they'll put up with a series of responses, and the person will have to pick one of the answers to say what is the appropriate emotional state for that situation. Essentially, 2 different ways of scoring this is: one is to have experts score the answer which is the most appropriate emotional response for the situation, and the second is to take the most popular choice for from the participants who took the test as the correct answer. In other words, the most dominant response is the correct answer, and logically the 2 should be the same, but they're not always the same. And one of the issues raised with performance-based tests is that the extent to which someone can objectively rate the emotions of others when they actually know insight to the emotions of others, and which in essence is one of the supposed problems with these type of tests, because they have actually no access to what the emotions of others are, and they make guesses on them, and by not having any access to that, it questions whether you could have a correct answer, whereas you can infer that you do have some access to your own emotions. There are several scales that will do this. One is the MSCEIT, and this is 141 items. It does take quite a long time to score. There is a much larger 400 item version of this tool, which takes even longer, of course, to score. It's got reasonably good test-retest correlations. It does behave like a performance test in that you get similar scores across 2 different completions, and therefore it can provide some useful information. The one of the key issues is which one to use, and do you want to assess ability or do you want to assess perceived ability, or both? And you can see good reasons as to why you want to assess ability. Do people in stressful situations, can they recognise when other people are experiencing stress? Can they recognise their own stress? Can they make correct decisions, and decisions which would be favourable to experts or favourable to the majority of people in that group? Or is it that their perceived ability is the key factor? Or do you want to assess both? And if you had enough time, and it might well be theoretically useful to assess both, and practically useful it could be to assess both, and in the end you'd want perceived ability and performance related scores to match up. But there may be situational constraints to using both, and that the amount of time it takes, or the extent to which these type of approaches, which are commonly used in business but less commonly used in sports psychology, particularly performance-based tests, would be deemed acceptable. So it's probably best to select the approach which suits the purpose of your work. And if your work is designed to improve people's beliefs that they can manage their own emotions, then it's likely that you would be using a perceived ability test.
When it comes to assessing coping measures, there's a wealth of coping measures that are available to use, and actually this has created some problems within the literature. For example, generalizability across studies. If you've got a whole range of different measures, that creates difficulties in that particular area. The use of similar measures with different populations who experience different kinds of stresses has been suggested as a way of increasing understanding of coping and the influence of contextual and situational factors on coping efforts and effectiveness. There are some examples here that are listed of commonly used coping questionnaires. Some of these are used specifically with adolescent populations, for example the ACOPE that you see. COPE itself actually stands for Coping Orientations with Problem Experiences. And that's exactly what the COPE looks at. It looks at kind of coping dispositions. So it's the use of coping strategies over a certain time frame. And when we look through the different coping measures that are available, as shown on the next slide, there are a range of coping questionnaires, and as Andy mentioned previously with the emotional intelligence questionnaires, it really depends on what your research question is as to which measure you may use. There are some coping questionnaires, for example, that have been designed to assess coping responses to specific stresses. But the most commonly used coping inventory within the literature to date is the brief cope, which we'll look at now. We've got modifications of the Ways of Coping questionnaire. This was the one developed by Susan Folkman, and she herself has been critical of this inventory, most notably at the recent British Psychological Society conference. So you've started to see a greater emergence of the COPE. There is a modified version for sport called the MCOPE, but if you're looking to use a coping inventory that looks at coping with stresses beyond sport, the brief COPE or the COPE would seem to be more appropriate. The COPE itself and its subscales have been used quite extensively within the sport coping literature, and they've demonstrated acceptable reliability and validity. The brief COPE itself was developed by Carver and colleagues because they found that respondents were getting frustrated with the number of items on the original COPE, and they found some of the items to be redundant as well. So they looked to develop a shorter version of the COPE. And they found, again, that internal consistency coefficients for these all fall within the values that are deemed to be minimally acceptable. So it's a tool that's been accepted as viable for use with sporting and non-sporting populations. Okay, task 2. What we're going to do within the following task is we're going to evaluate and interpret emotional intelligence and coping inventories. We've already asked you to complete a brief coping and emotional intelligence scale, but you'll be doing that if you haven't already done so. We'll ask you to calculate the scores for the subscales within the inventories. Then we want you to look at the scores. To what extent do they fit within your own views or perceptions as to your emotional intelligence or your use of coping strategies? What are the strengths and limitations of the two measures, so the brief cope and the EIS? Where do the difficulties lie in completing them? What's the face validity of the measures? And then we'll review your thoughts on this.